So, how was Europe? What were the components of the European way of life, if you will, in the 1900s? I'll here mention a couple of points just to get you on board our mental travel to Europe in the early 1900s. Uh, Although there were wars here and there, I think it's valid to argue that since 1815, there was a period in Europe of relative long-term peace. What do I mean by relative long-term peace? I mean that not all European countries have had immersed in a war, are taking part in a war with one another. From the 1850s all the way through to the First World War. However, that's not to say that we didn't have important peripheral wars. For instance, the Russo-Turkish War, the German, the Crimean War, etc. So there were wars in Europe. However, there wasn't a moment in time from the 1850s all the way through to the 1900s where all the major European powers and countries became involved in a war with one another. So that's one dimension on where we find Europe in the 1900s. Another dimension is that there is an incredible rise in literacy. People become more aware of the world around them. Newspapers proliferate more in Europe. People do read more and learn how to read. And this is coupled by advances in science and technology. You don't want me to talk to you about the Industrial Revolution, for instance, and I'm sure you all know a lot about. Also, different kinds of advances. For instance, we tend to forget that the telegraph that comes into being in Europe in the latter part of the 19th century is as revolutionary as the internet, or even more, is in our day. You know, the fact that usually it took days for the news to travel by boat, for instance, or the newspapers between America, Europe, or between European states. However, with the invention of the telegraph, instantly one can learn, the person who reads, for instance, can learn what happens in another European country. So the world is coming together in the 1900s in a way that resembles our age with regards to the internet and how we become a global village. So that's also another feature of the early 1900s. Together with the rise of literacy, with different advances in science and technology, comes what I would call the widening of the sphere of democratic representation. What do I mean by this? I mean that the right to vote. More people have the right to vote gradually. And I'll take the example of Britain, where we have as I'm sure you know, the different voting acts across the 19th century that widen the franchise, give more people the right to vote. Does that mean that in the 1900s in Europe, everyone has a right to vote? No. It is still a fraction of the population. However, there is a story of progression, of widening of the franchise. At the same time, Europe is known for having shorter working hours and work protections. And that is a result of the various struggles at the time of the Industrial Revolution onwards. So gradually, in the course of the 19th century, as we approach the beginning of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, there are minimal work protection systems at place. And the seeds of what we can call the welfare state are gradually being planted. And at the same time, in the realm of theory and philosophy, philosophers and artists discover the human subject. What do I mean by this? That may sound quite abstract. Is that we have an alignment of minds around the early 1900s, the beginning of the 20th century. Scholars like Freud, who discovers this thing called the unconscious. Philosophers like Nietzsche, who think about one's individual's place in the world. We have artist movements like Impressionism that try to rethink human subjectivity. But at the same time, so these things happen across Europe, and these are broad dynamics that, you know, lay the ground for how Europe sees itself in the early 20th century. We have imperial powers engaged in power struggles across the world. So one thing I'd like you to bear in mind with respect to this place of Europe in the early 20th century is that Europe is by far a rich continent and a continent that exerts its power across the world. An example of this is the so-called scramble for Africa. Now, if we were in class, I would ask how many of you are aware of it, what do you know about this, etc. Well, the scramble of Africa is a race among the key powerful European states, such as Belgium, Germany, Italy, Spain, and most importantly, the British and the French, to achieve imperial domination in that dark continent, as they call it, Africa, that is rich of natural resources. And case in point here is the Congress of Berlin on Congo that happens in the 1884-1885. By the way, I should really mention here that if you haven't had a look or if you have not heard it, there's in our current moment where a lot of issues about Europe's colonial heritage are being discussed. There is a very interesting movement occurring in Belgium that aims to shame the brutality by which the Belgian Empire at the time operated in Congo and the different various crimes that the Belgians did in Congo. What are the justifications for empire? So why is it that the European states, the key European powers, Britain, France, and then the others, why do they wish to acquire empires and aggrandize their power? Well, there are broadly speaking, three arguments. One is a cultural argument. They believe that by exercising domination over places like Africa, they are embarking on a civilizing mission to bring progress and civilization to the natives. Second justification for empire, economy. The idea that European states need to expand, they need to be able to trade more broadly, they need to create new markets. And what a better way to do that than exploiting the raw materials in other parts of the world that are deemed to be less developed. And the third justification for empire is nationalism. The idea that it's not only trade that a wealthy European state should be doing with different parts of the world that are less developed, but it's also a matter of national pride to be exercising their dominance over them. The idea that the trade follows the flag, that it's a competition between different states, Germany, France, Britain, etc., and the degree of domination over different parts of the world also gives national pride. Now, I hope I've given you a kind of overview of where Europe was in the early 20th century. I brought in some key dimensions. So we have a continent that is being quite, quote unquote, developed. Democracy, forms of democracy, not democracy the way we think about it today. That's important. Literacy, higher degrees of literacy. Scientific revolutions. The world comes closer in a way, and Europe is at the forefront of different kinds of scientific revolutions and progresses on that front. But the world in the 1900s is also a very unequal world, and European empires, namely Britain, France, then Germany, Italy, etc., Belgium, exercised imperial power over the non-European world, especially the world in Africa. And the justifications they offer for this vary. Economic justifications, civilizational justifications, nationalist justifications. And this is pretty much how the advent of the Great War finds the European continent. Now, in the next segment, I will be discussing the kind of what led to the coming of the Great War.